Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a really deep plunge into the body's architectural backbone, a region that is just foundational to clinical practice, but let's be honest, utterly maddening to visualize: the posterior abdominal wall and the retroperitoneum.
It really is.
We've pulled a stack of sources that treat this area like the ultimate three-dimensional puzzle, and our mission really is to build a clear mental picture for you without a single diagram in sight.
It's the engine room, you know. When you think of the posterior abdominal wall, what you're really defining is the back boundary of the abdominal cavity.
Okay.
And it's a highly layered region muscle, thick fascia, fat, and then the parietal peritoneum, the retroperitoneum itself, is that space between the wall and the peritoneum.
And right away, the sources just highlight the complexity. There's no uniform definition really for the boundary muscles and the internal organization of that space. It's kind of a mess.
It is. It's riddled with non-standardized terms.
Spaces, subcompartments, domains. It feels like anatomical chaos before we even start.
Precisely. But the contents are absolutely vital. This deep space houses major parts of the digestive system: the duodenum, the ascending and descending colons,
Right.
plus the organs we immediately think of: pancreas, kidneys, ureters, and the suprarenal or adrenal glands. And then anchoring the whole thing, of course, the massive vessels.
The aorta and the IVC.
The aorta, the inferior vena cava, and they're surrounded by the entire lumbar nervous system and all the lymphatic machinery.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
I think we have to start with the containment system, the fascia. The whole area is separated and defined by these dense layers. But what's important to get out of the way up front is this crucial clinical caveat. Our sources tell us that the spread of pathology like fluid or infection, it often doesn't respect those clean anatomical boundaries we memorize.
That is the ultimate tension here. It's the difference between the map and the territory. Structurally, we can start way at the back with the thoracolumbar fascia. Think of this as a massive multi-layered corset. It's made of what we call eponytic sheets. So broad, strong, flattened tendons.
So it's basically an external brace.
Yes. Its whole function is to separate the deep back muscles from the abdominal wall muscles, specifically the quadratus lumborum and psoas major. It's particularly thick at the bottom of the lumbar spine, where it acts as a stabilizing brace.
And as we move inwards from there...
We hit the iliopsoas fasciae, which cover those main internal muscle anchors.
Okay, so I'm picturing the psoas major muscle running vertically. What's covering that?
That would be the psoas fascia. It's a really dense layer on the muscle's anterior surface. It continues down, merges with the iliac fascia, and then up top, it forms the medial arcuate ligament.
And clinically, why does that matter?
Well, this fascia is a barrier. So if an infection, say from TB in the spine, tracks into the psoas muscle, the resulting psoas abscess will actually track down along this fascia. It contains it.
It's a channel.
Exactly. It's a channel because of its separating function.
And just below that, we've got the wide fan-shaped iliacus muscle that's covered by the iliac fascia.
Correct. It attaches high up on the inner iliac crest and then merges with the femoral sheath way down below. This layer is a huge player in regional anesthesia.
How so?
What's crucial to visualize is that both the femoral nerve and the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve lie under this specific fascia.
Okay.
So that makes the iliac fascia the precise landmark for image-guided nerve blocks for the hip and thigh.
Since we've mapped the structural fascia, we have to talk about the messy part. The nomenclature for the visceral fascia.
The eponym challenge.
The eponym challenge, exactly. Gerota's fascia, Toldt's fascia, Zucker-Candle's, Treitz's. I mean, it's enough to make you want to quit anatomy.
But there's a concept that cuts right through that naming chaos. Fusion fascia.
Fusion fascia, okay.
These are avascular planes, that's no blood vessels, that form during embryonic development when a mesentery fuses to the posterior wall. And while the names are confusing, these planes are absolutely vital.
Vital in practice.
Because surgically, they are consistent. Fusion fascia limit the spread of disease, they are natural boundaries, and crucially, they give the surgeon a clear avascular plane for dissection.
Right, less bleeding.
Exactly. When a surgeon's doing a hemicolectomy, they rely on that specific fusion fascia plane to perform a clean resection. Their surgical utility just outweighs the naming confusion.
Speaking of fusion, let's use these fascia to organize that retroperitoneal space into sort of functional compartments.
Yeah, we can ditch the old oversimplified classification and focus on 3 key functional regions.
Okay, first up, the perirenal space?
So this is bounded by the renal fascia, anterior and posterior layers. It's paired, and it tightly envelops the kidney and the suprarenal gland with a layer of fat in between.
And what's the key visualization detail here?
That these two spaces, the right and the left, they can sometimes communicate. They might interconnect anteriorly, often right in front of the aorta and the IVC.
Okay. Next, the peripancreatic space.
This is a really dense core area. It's got the duodenum, the head and body of the pancreas, and the origins of the superior mesenteric vessels. Its posterior boundary is the fusion fascia of trites.
The retropancreatic fascia.
Exactly. And this is a great example of functional containment. Fluid collections from, say, pancreatitis can extend into the gut mesenteries, but they're typically restricted from crossing into the neighboring perirenal or pericolic spaces.
They're walled off.
Walled off by these fascial barriers.
And finally, the pericolic spaces. These are the narrow strips around the ascending and descending colons.
Yep, and these are defined posteriorly by the retrocolic fascia of Toldt. This is the classic avascular plane a surgeon looks for. They enter it by cutting along what's called the white line of Toldt.
I've heard of that.
And the lateral extension of this same fascia, where it blends with the parietal peritoneum, that's what we call the lateroconal fascia.
That gives us the boundaries. Now we need to anchor everything to the skeleton and the big muscles that form the floor. The bones are pretty straightforward. Last two ribs, T12 to L5, sacrum, and ilium. Let's focus on the muscles.
The quadratus lumborum, or QL, is our key focus. It's an irregularly rectangular complex muscle. It attaches below to the iliac crest and then above to the 12th rib and the L1 to L4 transverse processes.
Sounds thick.
It is. It's usually in 3 layers of fascicles, which gives it that thickness and segmented look.
And what are its critical relationships with what's sitting on top of it?
Well, both the colon and the kidney lie anteriorly to the QL.
Yeah.
And critically, running right along the fascia on its anterior surface are several essential nerves, the subcostal, iliohypogastric, and ilioinguinal nerves.
And its action, beyond just side bending.
Its most essential and maybe non-obvious action is fixation. It stabilizes the 12th rib, which is crucial for the respiratory diaphragm to work efficiently when you breathe in.
Ah, so it's an anchor point.
It's an anchor point. Without it, the diaphragm would be pulling on a floppy rib. And while posterior hernias are rare, the QL does define a potential weak spot, the inferior lumbar triangle of Petit.
Let's shift focus to the massive pipelines that just dominate this case. The major vasculature. We'll start with the abdominal aorta.
Okay, so it begins at the aortic hiatus at 212, descends slightly to the left of the midline, anterior to the vertebrae L1 through L4.
And what's important here is what happens as we get older.
Yes. The aorta doesn't just get wider, it often becomes ectatic, so abnormally dilated and tortuous, meaning it gets kind of winding and twisted.
And that's not just an observation. That actually shifts things around.
It shifts everything. It changes the spatial positions of all the surrounding structures. It changes the angles of its major branches.
So we have this massive, potentially winding vessel off-center. What structures have to cross it in the front?
From top down, the aorta is crossed anteriorly by the coeliac trunk, the body of the pancreas, the superior mesenteric artery, and the horizontal part of the duodenum.
And what's happening behind it?
Posteriorly, it's just resting on the lumbar vertebrae and the anterior longitudinal ligament. This is also where the lumbar arteries come off. And here's where venous asymmetry really starts to kick in.
Okay.
The left lumbar veins, L3, L4, sometimes L2, have to cross posterior to the aorta to drain into the inferior vena cava, which is sitting over on the right.
Let's nail down those arterial branches because they really define the whole geography. We can categorize them for clarity.
We can. You have the anterior unpaired visceral branches for the gut, so coeliac, superior, and inferior mesenteric. Then the lateral paired visceral branches for the organs.
Middle suprarenal, renal arteries, gonadal arteries.
Correct. And finally, the dorsal group for the body wall. That includes the inferior phrenic and the 4 pairs of lumbar arteries.
Right, supplying the body wall posterolaterally.
And within the spinal branches of those lumbar arteries lies a critical clinical detail, a surgical landmine, really, the great radicular artery of Adamkiewicz. This artery supplies the lower spinal cord, and it frequently comes off an upper lumbar artery, usually on the left. Injury to this specific vessel during aortic surgery risks a devastating spinal cord infarction.
Wow. That immediately links to the clinical reality of abdominal aortic aneurysms, AAAs.
Mm-hmm.
They're most common below the renal arteries, and surgery is usually triggered when they hit, 5 to 5.5 centimeters?
That's right. Now, moving to the inferior vena cava, the IVC, It's formed by the junction of the common iliac veins at L5, positioned about a centimeter to the right of the midline.
And it ascends in a groove on the back of the liver.
Exactly. And it's notable because its abdominal portion is entirely valveless.
That seems counterintuitive. For such a major ascending vessel, what's the implication of having no valves in the abdomen?
It just means the IVC's diameter is highly susceptible to changes in abdominal pressure. During respiration or strain, it's basically a large, pliable conduit.
What's crossing in front of the IVC?
It's crossed anteriorly by the root of the small intestine mesentery, the right gonadal artery, the horizontal duodenum, the head of the pancreas, and the hepatoduodenal ligament.
Okay, the venous return here. This defines the extreme asymmetry of the region, especially with the gonadal and renal veins.
Absolutely. The right gonadal vein drains directly into the IVC. Simple. But the left gonadal vein drains indirectly into the left renal vein.
Okay.
And this forces the left renal vein to be 3 times longer than the right. It has to traverse that high-traffic intersection, the tight angle between the superior mesenteric artery and the aorta, just to reach the IVC.
It sounds like we're asking the left renal vein to navigate a potentially compressed path just to empty its contents.
That's a perfect visualization. Any compression there, the so-called nutcracker phenomenon, has massive implications for the organs draining into it, including the left gonad and suprarenal gland.
And we have to mention the ascending lumbar veins.
They're so critical. These paired veins connect the lumbar veins and merge with the subcostal veins to form the azygos and hemiazygos systems.
So they're a backup system.
They are the emergency bypass road. If the IVC is obstructed by a tumor, thrombosis, even a large pregnancy, these ascending lumbar veins provide the critical collateral circulation, shunting blood up to the superior vena cava.
Let's look at the wiring and drainage. The nervous control starts with the lumbar plexus, formed by the L1 through L4 ventral rami,
And it's generated mostly within the substance of the psoas major muscle itself.
which explains the referred symptoms.
Completely. If you have an inflammatory process, like a retrocecal appendicitis on the right side, it can irritate these nerve branches inside the muscle, causing pain or sensory disturbance referred way down to the thigh or hip.
Let's highlight the clinical vulnerabilities of those specific nerves.
Okay, take the iliohypogastric nerve, T12L1. It runs over the quadratus lumborum. If you injure it during lower abdominal surgery, you can weaken the posterior wall of the inguinal canal, which increases the risk of a direct hernia.
And the ilioinguinal nerve is another common victim, right?
Very common. Frequently injured or entrapped during hernia repairs, causing sensory loss to the external genitalia.
And the genitofemoral nerve, L1, L2, that emerges directly onto the anterior surface of the psoas.
Its genital branch is also highly vulnerable during inguinal hernia repairs, and it can lead to some nasty postoperative neuralgia. This entire network just underscores how easily deep damage translates into superficial pain.
For the drainage system, the lymphatics here are routing everything back to the center, towards the cisterna chyli and thoracic duct.
Yep, 2 main node groups. The pre-aortic nodes, clustered around the gut arteries, drain the whole GI tract, and then the lateral aortic or para-aortic nodes, which flank the aorta and IVC.
And those drain the deep body wall and the paired organs.
Kidneys, suprarenals, and gonads.
There's a specific asymmetric pattern for the gonads, right? Reflecting that vascular asymmetry we talked about.
Exactly. Lymph from the left testis drains cleanly to the left lateral aortic nodes. But lymph from the right testes often takes a more complex route. It drains to the right and then frequently crosses over to the left lateral aortic nodes.
And that final collection point for all of this is the cisterna chyli.
The cisterna chyli is the abdominal origin of the thoracic duct, usually formed by the union of the intestinal trunk and the left lumbar trunk around L1, L2.
And it's not a static structure.
Not at all. It's a saccular dilation that MRI studies show expands considerably when a person just goes from lying down to standing up. Clinically, surgeons performing major periaortic surgery have to be so careful.
Why is that?
Injury to these major lymphatic vessels risks significant lymph leakage. You can end up with chylocystis or chylothorax.
So we've mapped the tight muscular floor, the massive off-center vessels, and the vulnerable network of nerves and lymphatics, all constrained within this complex web of fusion fascia.
We've visualized the perirenal, peripancreatic, and paracolic spaces, defined by the functional containment of layers like Toldt and Treitz. We've seen how the aorta and IVC dominate the midline but create these highly asymmetrical plumbing risks, especially for the left renal vein.
Right.
And we understand how the lumbar plexus is anchored inside the psoas muscle, making it a messenger for deep pathology.
This brings us right back to where we started, that tension We've defined these strict anatomical boundaries, Gerota, Toldt, Trites, which, in theory, restrict the spread of fluid and disease. Yet the clinical reality, as our sources note, is that fluid collections, abscesses, they frequently ignore these named fascial boundaries because real-world pathology is just dynamic.
This really raises an important question for you, the clinician or the learner listening to this. If the classic anatomical maps provide boundaries that are often porous in the face of pathology, how much should you rely purely on those diagrams when tracking a life-threatening abscess?
Versus what?
Versus integrating and really trusting real-time cross-sectional imaging like a CT or MRI to see precisely where the pathology actually went in 3 dimensions. The lesson here is that anatomy provides the potential paths, but imaging provides the definitive itinerary.
That is a truth bomb. That's a deep dive wrapped up. Thank you for joining us as we navigated the intricate complexity and crucial clinical relevance of the posterior abdominal wall.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you on the next deep dive.